Welcome to Triple Canopy. For people who aren't familiar, this is Triple Canopy's headquarters. It's an online magazine. Issues often include live events and some printed materials. I am guest editor along with my co-editors Lara Mimosa Montes and Molly Kleiman of issue 24, Risk Pool, which this is a part of. Risk Pool, among other questions, asks how we name and define illness and who does that naming and defining and what the implications are of that naming and defining. We say it more eloquently in the issue. And we launched last January. It's continuing to unfold. We still have some forthcoming contributions by Carolyn Lazard, who a lot of you know and are here to hear speak. Greg Bordowitz has something coming up, as does Fia Backstrom and a number of other people. So this event today is called How We Do Illness, and some of you heard this earlier, but How We Do Illness is a sentence, a concept that we blatantly thieved from Lisa Diedrich, who is here with us today, who wrote a book this past year called Indirect Action, Schizophrenia, Epilepsy, AIDS, and the Course of Health Activism. Yeah, from University of Minnesota Press. And so I had just kind of flagged that sentence when I read Lisa's book, and it really stuck with Lara and Molly as well. Just how we do illness, it's political, and that just seemed like such a generative concept, and it's made for a generative day, so thank you. And this event is You Can Hear It in My Voice, which I'll read the line that is from, just reading from the event description, so you might be familiar with this. In the Cancer Journals from 1980, Audre Lorde reflects following a surgery to remove a tumor from her breast on illness as being at once intimate and social. In quotes, "Of course I'm afraid. You can hear it in my voice, because the transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation, and that always seems fraught with danger. When confronted with her mortality," and then again in quotes, "priorities and omissions became strongly etched in a merciless light, and what I most regretted were my silences." And so today we've brought together Carolyn Lazard and Beza Merid and Lana Lin, who will each present for about 20 minutes their work, and then the four of us will sit on the stage and talk, and please jump in and ask questions. So we should be done by 6:30, and you might have dinner plans. Buy some booze, drink some coffee, there's more water, bathrooms are there and there. We have various Triple Canopy publications for sale, as well as Lana Lin's book from last year, Freud's Jaw. Your subtitle's a little bit, oh wait, I have it right here, I think. What's the subtitle?
Freud's Jaw and Other Lost Objects, Fractured Subjectivity in the Face of Cancer.
Freud's Jaw and Other Lost Objects, Fractured Subjectivity in the Face of Cancer, which I highly recommend, and it's for sale here. I had one more picture on my phone of our website that I am going to read to you from, which is, in our introduction, we bring up illness narratives. It's something that we've talked a lot about in editing this issue. Illness narratives can mean many things. It can be a Facebook post, it can be a GoFundMe testimonial or a fundraising paragraph, it could be a memoir, all sorts of things. So one of the questions we ask in the intro is, this issue seeks modes of narration in which testimony does not automatically supply reparation, and resists the valorization of the author, who assumes full personhood through the production of images and words, if only to emphasize that persistence often looks more like laziness, boredom, distraction, endurance, and not only for the afflicted individual. So first up, I'll introduce each of you as you come up. So Carolyn Lazard is going to go first, and I've had the pleasure of working with Carolyn for a while now on their forthcoming essay, as of yet untitled maybe, that they will read from and speak about. And I had, as many of you, been very moved by Carolyn's essay from 5 years ago, How to Be a Person in the Age of Autoimmunity. So returning to conversations about that essay and what the next one has been really fruitful and engaging between us. So please welcome Carolyn.
Thanks for coming. Thank you, Triple Canopy. Hi to everybody on the live feed, to the sick people. And yeah, I also want to say thanks to Corrine and for all of her emotional labor on this piece of writing. Y'all should give her a raise. And yeah, so I'm going to read some sections. This is not really finished. It's really not finished. It's kind of disjointed, so I'll be jumping from section to section. It might not make sense. It might be best to listen as if you're just listening to some prose and maybe not like an organized essay. So I'll start. A life-changing experience did not bring me to holistic healthcare. I was born into it. My parents were, for lack of a better term, New Agers in the 80s and 90s, and I was raised in a home that was deeply distrustful of biomedicine. They went to self-development and meditation retreats and somehow resisted the wave of Scientology and Unification Church conversions. They fudged immunization records, homeschooled me, and fed me a steady vegetarian diet of soy and whole wheat, which in our current wellness culture seems comical. In the summer of 1995, I broke my arm playing capture the flag at camp. Running through the woods at top speed, I tripped over a log, falling hard. I remember an adult throwing me over their shoulder and trying to walk as quickly and lightly as possible as I cried, mouth wide open, unable to emit a sound. My camp medical folder said that I was not to be given pain medication before consulting with my parents first. My parents couldn't be reached, so I was brought to the ER, x-rayed, casted, and left without any pain meds. There were other attempts made to shelter me from the evils of biomedicine. A trip to Haiti to visit family was preceded by a trip to a Chinese herbalist to procure herbs in lieu of CDC-recommended vaccines. Antibiotics were avoided at all costs. My image of a life unburdened by biochemical dependency remained intact. Only as I aged, as those close to me came to need antiretrovirals, surgeries to remove tumors, antipsychotics, and the like, did this fiction start to wear down, as the body inevitably does. Chronically ill people find ways to mediate their experience of illness with methods from outside of biomedicine's prescribed solutions. Whether that be astronomically priced naturopathic consultations or one's grandmother's herbal remedies, patients often keep one foot in each of these two discrete worlds, running from a conventional practitioner appointment to alternative practitioner appointment. These epistemological shifts can be negotiated multiple times in a single day. What professionals on both sides of the ideological divide refuse to understand is that most sick people, people who desire health, those who seek it and pursue it, are open to anything that will work, no matter its origin. I've come to understand that the enemy of health is neither pharmaceuticals nor snake oil, but dogma. The body is too unwieldy to fit within the schema of authoritative interpretation. There have been dogmatic attempts to frame the body in a totalizing discourse, but it always slips out before the moment of capture. Sometimes my body is transparent, exemplary of karma, of action and reaction, and sometimes it is a solid brick of impenetrable, unknowable matter. Whatever it is, I am my body as much as it completely evades me. The role of belief in the recovery process is so powerful that it must be sequestered as a control factor in clinical studies. Why is there no space for belief within healthcare? Besides, of course, the particular position of the hospital chaplain or the hospital chapel. Faith and belief index a haptic quality to the health of the body and the mind, a thought about a thing which one cannot see or perceive, a conviction based on a feeling, a touchy-feely approach to the body, the tension between reason and feeling which permeates illness and which dominates most of what is living. I tread lightly in this terrain because it is also the terrain of what we've come to understand as quackery. It is the world of Louise Hay, a world in which you can heal AIDS with your thoughts, and so much like And so, much like the healing process, I take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I'm trying to understand this process not as a series of actions or steps, but as a nexus of incommensurate, disjointed experiences that carry me to places other than the world we ostensibly share and live in. I wanted to write something about how, as a medicalized subject, I became desperate and turned to holistic medicine and non-Western healing traditions. I wanted to write about how some of those frameworks led me to different ways of relating to my sick body. I could understand that I have an autoimmune disorder, a pathological mechanism with no known origin. I could also understand that I have a dysregulated nervous system triggered by chronic and traumatic events during the developmental stages of my life. I desperately text my dear friend Cyrus, who also writes sometimes about personal things. Question: in your book, do you write about family trauma stuff? I'm just really struggling with how to write about trauma. I feel like it can't be done. Like it can't be done, like therapeutically, definitely, it's really helpful, but I feel like it can never approach what is actually being described and kind of fall short. He responds, it's such a difficult thing, and I've tried so many versions of it, and the big split for me is that writing confessionally is healing, but some of what I need to write about I just don't feel comfortable or ready to share with the world. But then when there are things I don't say, and I know there's something absent in the reading, that makes stories seem less fleshed out. I've been trying to communicate the significance of things without naming exactly what they are, rather than pretending that writing to share work isn't an exercise in being public, just accepting that and breaking the fourth wall a bit and just writing about why they are, things I can't share or say. And even if that more self-reflective stuff doesn't stay in, it's always helpful. And as a reader, I appreciate it so much when a writer acknowledges what's scary or vulnerable about the form and why it's imperfect. There are things that happened to me as a kid that made me grow up quickly. There are things that happened to me as a kid that arrested my development. And there are things that continue to happen. The things that are particular to the world that we live in, that continue to operate in and through me. Personal and systemic traumas, acute and mundane traumas. I'm uncertain if the details of these traumas are necessary. There's a demand for evidence when we write about the body. It's clinical. There's an expectation that confessional writing about one's own bodily experiences contains a kind of innate authority. My body has become my object of study, but I hope to not reproduce the forms of authorial knowledge that my doctors claim to produce. I seek the autonomy to play with my body, but not the authority to know it. Without being confessional, without the evidentiary demand for self-disclosure, there are some relevant things that I can say. I spent a lot of my childhood feeling ashamed. As a kid, I was convinced that the circumstances of my life were my own making. I walked on eggshells. I tried to not ruin the vibe for fear of consequences. I ignored my feelings against every sign that things were not okay. And as an adult, this continued to be the case, a relational pattern. I think this has something to do with why I became sick. So I'm going to stop there. It's a long essay. I kind of go on to talk about different ways that I have experimented with my healthcare and talking about using psychedelics, and also about my relationship to Haitian voodoo and spirit possession, and trying to talk about the relationship between the body and trauma and ghosts. So that's it, and hopefully it'll be done soon and you can read it. But I guess I before I leave this seat, I maybe wanted to talk a little bit about my experiences around writing narratives about illness, personal narratives about illness, and this essay that Corrine brought up, How to Be a Person in the Age of Autoimmunity, was an essay that I wrote at a time that's kind of hard to imagine now, because it was at a time where I had very little community around chronic illness. I think I knew one other person with Crohn's disease that was a 19-year-old who was the son of my mother's colleague or something, and that was the only person that I knew. And then I sort of wrote this sort of coming out narrative in a way about being chronically ill and about the experience of that. And what it did, or what I think this kind of writing can do, is that it really instantiated a community around me, which is that I didn't know anybody, and then all of a sudden I knew too many sick people. And then a lot of art and organizing became sort of oriented around that. And I think I've been thinking a lot about, also as somebody who's a working artist, like the relationship between writing and making art is very different for me. I think people do things for different reasons, but I think there are things that writing can do that art can't do, and there are things that art can do that writing can't do. And, you know, I think for me, a lot of my art and my writing are actually really different from each other. And I think the reason for that is because there's a way in which, with my artwork, I'm invested in thinking about how the work relates institutionally and infrastructurally, and whereas with writing, maybe it's naive, but it feels like there's more of a capacity for a kind of direct address, and it has to do with distribution and circulation and the way that writing kind of operates in the world, that I can, write something and put it online, and that it can reach a sick person who's like incredibly isolated in some other part of the world or another part of the country, which can't really happen with artwork, because there's a kind of need for a capacity to be there. And I think writing can sort of move through space in a different way, and so that's why it becomes necessary, or there's a kind of way in which it can be a kind of politicized practice around making illness visible in ways that art doesn't do that for me personally. I'm not saying for everybody, but just the way that I work. And then, I guess thinking about that last essay and its relationship to this one, Corinne and I were talking yesterday about what it means that I wrote this long thing 5 years ago and I'm writing another long thing now, and thinking about this as a practice in and of itself, which is that what's nice is that I'm really hoping, the thing about chronic illness is that it's chronic, and it's I don't know what that means, but I do know that even as things stay the same, I have shifting relationships to my body and shifting relationships to illness that I think should be documented, and that as those ideas change, I'd like to write them down. So, this one is the last one was kind of about capitalism. This one's about woo-woo, and I don't know what the next one will be. If I'm still here, I'll write it. So thank you.
So next is Beza Merid. Beza was kind enough to fly here from Ann Arbor, where he teaches and researches at the University of Michigan. So I became aware of Beza's work through our mutual friend, Carrie, and it was kind of speaking to Carolyn's point, we had started this issue and it was out in the world being distributed, and it reached a friend of a friend in Michigan who is, Beza's doing research, and I'll let him tell you more about the research in the next 20 minutes, about illness narratives and affective appeals and how those can be utilized in health activism in the resistance to the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. And he will speak much more on that front. But yeah, I'm very pleased to have you here, and thank you for sharing your work with us. Please welcome Beza.
So I want to talk just a little bit about some of my research around illness narratives, and in particular, sort of ideas around how we do illness online, and as a result of that, how our experiences of illness become social and not sort of isolating in the way that they, I think, oftentimes can be. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in is how we share information about our illness experiences. And so I think a lot of times that can be in the form of personal health data. So when we sort of track and measure and quantify our risks for disease or our diseases that are diagnosed, or when we're actually sharing sort of more fleshed out narratives, I think there are different ways that we think about sharing this kind of information that I think can actually be sort of merged in, I think, sort of interesting ways. And I'm interested in the ways in which we understand the sharing of information about illness as part of a sort of collected effort to maybe change cultural perceptions about what illness is or what it can be, and then also how we can sort of use it to catalyze social movements and political activism in particular. I come to this work in thinking about sort of the importance of how thoroughly our experiences of illness have been mediated, and so the ways in which we sort of oftentimes learn about illness or experience them primarily or largely through sort of digital media and sort of the kind of worlds that are kind of constructed around these kinds of illness experiences. And the core sort of question that drives this particular work is thinking about how we talk about the sharing of personal health data in the way that we do when we talk about people sharing data for the public good, and thinking about how we can sort of transport that kind of logic on top of why we share illness narratives. And so what would it mean to sort of share illness narratives in the name of the public good at sort of a large sort of structural scale? And so that's how I come to this particular work. So when we think about the social practices of sharing sort of personal health data and these kinds of mediated experiences of illness, I think a lot of times we might think of, electronic health records and the ways in which our clinical experiences get mediated. And so increasingly, clinicians are using these kinds of electronic health records to sort of document and sort of communicate this information either with other clinicians or with us so that we could also participate in sort of medical decision making. We can think about consumer devices that we use to track and sort of basically sort of capture these kinds of data either actively or passively, right? So the ways in which you sort of use things like Apple Watches and these kinds of sort of software in order to, again, track our risk factors for disease or to, again, track our actual sort of diagnosed diseases. We can also think about the ways in which we use devices that oftentimes are part of closed systems and how they can actually withhold some of our personal data. And so one of the practices that we know about is that people end up having to sort of hack into these devices as a way to get access to their data. And so, for example, if people can't get full access to their personal health data, or if a device maker stops supporting a particular device, a lot of times people will need to sort of find ways into these systems in order to get access to the data that their bodies produce. And they'll end up sharing both strategies for hacking these devices on online patient communities, but then also sharing some of their own personal health data, right? So there are a lot of ways in which we're already sharing this kind of personal information about health when we think about it in terms of datafied forms. And so one of the things I'm interested in thinking about is what that looks like when the data that we're sharing are actually illness narratives. And so we end up seeing a lot of different websites and sort of patient communities online that allow people to share these sort of more narrated forms of illness. And so as Corrine was mentioning, there are things like GoFundMe or Caring Bridge where people can sort of foster communities online and sort of solicit financial support to pay for medical care. But there are also sites like Patients Like Me that basically allow people to share these kinds of information so they can share personal health data about their symptoms or the medications that they're taking, but also actual narratives that they're sort of crafting to describe their illness experiences. And they're doing this kind of sort of practice of sharing to not only help other people experiencing these illnesses, but also to help researchers. And so with Caring Bridge in particular, they talk about sort of doing this research for the public good. And the idea is that you're doing this to sort of create a kind of common, sort of collectively produced knowledge store about what actual illness experiences are like. And so I'm interested in thinking about how we might, again, think about this knowledge of sharing for the public good when we're talking about illness narratives. One of the things that we see in terms of why people share their personal health data, according to a 2014 survey from the Health Data Exploration Project, is that people who are already producing and sharing these kinds of personal health data oftentimes are more likely to do it, or actually very excited to share this kind of data and grant access to researchers who are going to be sort of creating this kind of work in the name of the public good. And so I think there's a lot of times resistance against sharing these data with corporations that are going to monetize it. But if people know that it's for researchers who are creating this kind of a data store, people tend to be really excited about that, right? So thinking about why people sort of get tuned into this idea that we can create a sort of collective knowledge store and tap into what I think a lot of people think of as a sort of shared responsibility to sort of create a broader understanding of illness is what really sort of draws me here. And so that brings me to a case study that I want to talk about. In July of 2017, on July 3rd, in fact, I went to a healthcare protest in Los Angeles that was held in front of the Harbor UCLA County Hospital, which is one of the big county hospitals in LA. The protest was organized by the Fight for Our Health campaign, which is a protest organization that's sponsored by the Service Employees International Union. It's a left-leaning labor union that does a lot of work with the Democratic Party. And they do a lot of organizing around like the Fight for 15 campaign and also a lot of health organizing as well. And so basically, this campaign was meant to resist the ongoing repeal and replace effort that is intended to strip away various protections from the Affordable Care Act, but also eliminate the ACA altogether. And so this protest was attended by a number of patients and patient activists, caregivers. There were a number of physicians there from the hospital. There were a lot of LA political figures, and then as you can see, just under the banner, Senator Kamala Harris was there as well. And so people were there sort of to really demonstrate their resistance against this ongoing repeal and replace effort, but also to share these deeply personal illness narratives. And so, people were chanting, and it was just like any protest that you might go to. People were chanting and sort of passing out leaflets and different kinds of information. And then the people who were organizing the protest had a number of individuals come on stage to share these really deeply affecting narratives. And people were sort of breaking down on stage and talking about what it was like to live with various diseases, and in particular, pre-existing conditions before the Affordable Care Act, when basically you wouldn't necessarily have health insurance. The relief that came after the Affordable Care Act was passed and its federally mandated protection for people with pre-existing conditions. And then now the experience of what I call health insurance precarity, where basically people have to, again, confront this idea of what it would be like to go back to not having health insurance or to potentially be deemed uninsurable, right? And so the sort of fallout being that they might have to confront not only that kind of uncertainty that's just like a pall over them for all times, but thinking about maybe dying a premature death, right? And so thinking about the ways in which people are telling these narratives really got me interested in particular, this intersection of health activism and the way that the campaign kind of makes an explicit pitch that health activism is a collective responsibility that we all share. And in particular, the idea that there's this lot of organizing around pre-existing conditions in particular. So as I imagine maybe a lot of people in the room already know, pre-existing conditions are basically medical conditions that exist prior to the start date of medical insurance coverage, right? And so before the ACA, basically if you had a pre-existing condition, insurers could choose to just refuse to cover you, right? And so the way it worked was that if you declared a pre-existing condition, or if they found one when they would do their pretty deep investigations into your medical history, then they could either refuse to cover you outright, they could cover you but then charge you more for insurance. They could cover you partially, or they could exclude the body part or body system that was sort of affected by this condition. And so, there are a lot of different adverse conditions that they could apply, but the idea basically is that you were really at their own mercy. And so they had these field manuals that would detail these different declinable conditions, as they called them. And so if you take a look, you can see some things that maybe are not surprising in terms of why an insurance company wouldn't want to offer coverage, right? So they would, I'm sure, think that AIDS and HIV are too expensive, or cancer, or, a lot of different diagnoses that are maybe not surprising. But then there are other things here that are perhaps a little more surprising. So thinking about pregnancy or obesity as things that are declinable conditions that, health insurers would not want to cover and could choose not to cover, I think gives you a sense of really how widespread the problem tended to be. And so again, thinking about the kind of lived experience of pre-existing conditions gives you a sense of how desperate the kind of situation was, right? So understanding that you had to basically sort of worm your way around the medical system and sort of the bureaucracy of hospitals and healthcare administrators and health insurance agents, and basically depend on their largesse to sort of help you find or sort of bend the rules in order to get health insurance as a way to just sort of survive, right? So thinking about the kind of resilience that was sort of needed just to sort of negotiate survival, I think informs the kinds of protests that result as sort of a product of this refusal to cover people, right? And so I was really interested in what this meant to the campaign and how it ended up organizing people's sort of activities around the campaign. I'm curious, does anybody in the room know roughly how many people in the US have pre-existing conditions? You can shout it out if you know, or if you have a guess. 45%? 70%? So according to 2017 data from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, I think it's something like 133 million people, which is roughly half of all non-elderly Americans, have one or more pre-existing conditions, right? So thinking about that, 133 million people, I'm not going to ask anyone here, but you can think about how many people in this room might have pre-existing conditions, or how many of our loved ones or friends might have pre-existing conditions. And so the idea here is that it really is a pretty sort of pervasive problem, and the fact that we tend not to cover them, or we didn't cover pre-existing conditions before the ACA, is really appalling to me, and it's a thing that I don't quite understand, just sort of as a matter of course. And so thinking about the importance of this particular federal mandate for coverage in the ACA, and why it's important for people, and why people are so riled up about the idea that would be stripped away, I think drives sort of the particular importance of these protests. And so what this campaign, the Fight for Our Health campaign, does is they gather these kinds of illness narratives as a way to sort of force legislators' hand, to sort of illustrate to them the actual lived experiences that come along with these pre-existing conditions. And so they don't only talk about pre-existing conditions, but those are the ones that I tend to focus on. So this work is actually representative of an article that I have coming out where I talk about health activism in particular around pre-existing conditions. And so they will go to these protests and they will have people sort of volunteer to deliver these illness narratives. And so these are all people who have been to protests or have in other ways sort of interacted with the campaign. And they'll have them sort of share these narratives. And what they do is they have volunteers basically look for particularly compelling narratives as a way to sort of illustrate to legislators, because those are the primary audience, and then also other people who are not ill, exactly what the sort of lived experiences of illness tend to be, right? These narratives tend to be deeply affecting. The videos themselves are pretty short, but they're meant to be sort of powerful and kind of impactful in a short amount of time. And so I want to look closely at just one of them real quick. This is Donna. She has a cardiac issue, and so for all these videos, they're wearing a shirt that says, "Hello, my pre-existing condition is," and then we'll sort of write it on there. And so what you see is that people are talking about the stakes of these pre-existing conditions and why they need coverage, and they really are sort of instructed to kind of frame these in sort of pretty dire terms. And so the idea is that life was bad before, the ACA is saving our lives, it's literally saving our lives. Without it, we will die. It's life and death. It's that simple, right? And so that's the sort of model of these videos. All right, maybe I won't play. We'll just go to the video here.
My name is Donna Marie Robinson, and I am fighting for our health. I was fit, I was healthy, I worked out, I ate right, did all the right things, and I ended up with cardiomyopathy. I ended up with an enlarged heart and ventricular tachycardia. And it's been a long 18-month journey. I want my congressman to know that people like me need access to affordable health care. We need to be able to live our lives and be productive members of society, and it's almost impossible to do that if we don't have access to good, affordable health care. I am not ready to die. I have a lot to live for, and there are people, millions of people in my shoes. We are not ready to die, and without access to affordable health care, that is not a possibility.
So that's what a lot of these narratives end up looking like, and they really sort of illustrate the ways in which the illness experience, I think, for a lot of people, especially with pre-existing conditions, is sort of bound by this relationship between fear and hope. This sort of fear of being uninsurable, this fear of dying a premature death, this fear of sort of what might happen to you or your family if you sort of became bankrupt because of a sort of a medical bankruptcy, right? And that's tied to this sort of hope for a potential future, a hope for a future in which we have these kinds of protections that are further enshrined and where people can actually thrive, right? And so it sort of explores the kind of emotional relationship that people have and the kind of investment that they have to make into these kinds of campaigns. And so one of the things that the campaign does is really focus on storytelling as a way to sort of persuasively communicate this information. So as part of this research, I talked to the story coordinator for the campaign, and she talks about sort of all the research that she does to make sure that her focus in these campaigns is grounded in kind of like theories of storytelling that adequately explain sort of why people find these kinds of stories more compelling than just like didactic information. And so one of the things I think that I found is that you have this clearly sort of affecting narrative that people are trying to tell. It's framed around these sort of life and death stakes, but also we know that it's not necessarily going to be persuasive, right? And so I think what happened in the summer of 2017 is that there was enough of an outrage and enough of sort of vocal kind of response to the Affordable Health Care Act and the Better Care Reconciliation Act, both in the House and the Senate, that eventually sort of a lot, both of those plans were beat back, and the GOP had to sort of pull back on their plans to repeal the ACA, but the plans are ongoing, right? And so they repealed the individual mandate. They're still working on sort of ways to kind of make the ACA unconstitutional, and so there's litigation that's happening from the state of Texas that's again working to kind of peel these laws back. And so this is work that is still ongoing, because really the effort to repeal the ACA is still happening as well. And so I think one of the things that's jarring here is that there's an investment among all these people who are submitting these kinds of narratives in a future that may not necessarily come, right? They may still face these premature deaths. And so when we tell these kinds of stories and when we listen to these kinds of stories, it could all be for naught, but I think it's still worth sort of doing this work. And so that's the kind of area that I'm focusing on now. So I'm thinking about how we sort of make the transition from how we sort of share personal health data for the public good to how we might share illness narratives for the public good. This, by the way, is the intake form that they take. So you could see, they sort of prompt you in terms of what kind of information you might want to submit. So has it saved your life? Did you have insurance before? Could you not afford coverage? Those kinds of things. So I'm thinking about how we might share illness narratives for the public good. I'm thinking about how we could marshal illness narratives in a really sort of structured way, right? So if we think about what happened in the summer of 2017, it was kind of a sort of spontaneous outburst of a lot of different people telling these kinds of narratives, and it sort of happened idiosyncratically. But I wonder what would happen if there was a more sort of structural approach that tackled this issue, which is a large structural inequity, right? And so I was thinking about how to be a patient in the age of autoimmunity, and this notion that Carolyn brings up about using your illness as a weapon, which is a really provocative idea. So I wonder if there's a way to sort of create an illness narratives data commons in the way that we have these other sort of data commons around personal health data, to sort of drive people to buy into this idea, to sort of spread knowledge and sort of make sure that these kinds of illness narratives are as deeply felt as they need to be, but also to actually use them specifically as a political tool to be used on legislators who are sort of deciding whether or not we have this sort of affordable health coverage that's sort of widely accessible. And so I'm really curious about what might be possible if we think about this as something that needs to be organized in a broad structural way as opposed to a sort of more idiosyncratic response. And so I'm toying with the idea now of actually building an illness narratives data commons. I think there are a lot of issues with that. There are a lot of problems around sort of data privacy and sort of data ownership. And in particular, if you anonymize these data and sort of share these narratives, it's still possible to sort of trace them back and de-anonymize them. And so to the extent that insurance companies and sort of, people are able to kind of trace back these kinds of data points and find out a lot of information about our health and sort of use that to determine how much health insurance costs us, there are a lot of problems with this idea, but it's a thing that I want to explore. So I'll go ahead and stop there, and I'd love to talk more about this during the questions.
Thank you, Beza. Finally, we have Lana Lin, author of the aforementioned Freud's Jaw. As Lana has a new film called The Cancer Journals Revisited, and she will be showing a 9 or 10 minute excerpt of that film, which is a 99-minute film in total. And I will let Lana describe her film more, but it's a revisitation or a revisioning of Audre Lorde's The Cancer Journals from 1980. And you will see. But I'm very excited to see this clip, and I hope you all enjoy it. Welcome, Lana.
Hi. Thank you so much to Corrine and to you all for coming, and to Triple Canopy. I was very excited to learn that I would be in dialogue with Carolyn Beza, because I was familiar with their work, and I think it really resonates with my own. And so that was exciting. So I just want to say a few words of introduction for this clip that Corrine just mentioned, and then I will play it, and then I will say more. Between 2016 and 2018, after my own breast cancer diagnosis, 6 years after my own breast cancer diagnosis, I invited people from a range of backgrounds, ages, ethnicities, and sexual and gender identities to read excerpts from the Cancer Journals, poet Audre Lorde's 1980 memoir, and to reflect upon its meaning for them personally and professionally. And actually, Carolyn is one of the participants. But I'm sorry to disappoint you. She's not in the 9-minute clip I'm showing. You'll have to wait to watch the full film for that. In the film, The Cancer Journals Revisited, these 27 readers form a kind of prism that refracts the biomedical, political regime in which many U.S. residents are unwillingly embedded. Each reader offers a distinct angle through which to view the impacts of a disease that raises provocations around race, gender, class, environment, and ability, such as why Black women in the U.S. die of breast cancer at higher rates than any other group, and how breast cancer and its treatment fosters an image of femininity that disallows gender variance and nonconformity. A cinematic documentation of everyday urban life, the Cancer Journals Revisited is partially shot on expired Super 8mm and 16mm film stock that I had carried around, unrefrigerated and unexposed, for over 20 years. The survival of this raw stock under precarious conditions bespeaks the survival of bodies under threat of destruction. Like a life-threatening diagnosis, the film asks for a re-evaluation of priorities, posing the question of what kind of life is worth living and what kind of world is worth fighting for. So I'll just show 10 minutes from the beginning of the film, and then I'll come back.
Nobody wanted to die on the way, caught between ghosts of whiteness and the real water. None of us wanted to leave our bones on the way to salvation. 3 planets to the left a century of light years ago. Our spices are separate and particular, but our skins sing in complementary keys. At 7:45, meantime, we were telling the same stories over and over and over.
Broken down gods survive in the crevasses and mud pots of every beleaguered city, where it is obvious there are too many bodies to cart to the ovens or gallows, and our uses have become more important than our silence. After the fall, too many empty cases of blood to bury or burn, there will be nobody left to listen, and our labor has become more important than our silence. Our labor has become more important than our silence.
I am standing here as a Black lesbian poet, and the meaning of all that waits upon the fact that I am alive at all, and I had not thought to be. Less than 2 months ago, I was told by 2 doctors, one female and one male, that I would have to have breast surgery, and that there was a 60 to 80% chance that the tumor was malignant. Between that telling and the actual surgery, there was a 3-week period of the agony of an involuntary reorganization of my entire life. This is a situation I know faced by many women, by some of you perhaps here now. But some of what I experienced during that time has helped to elucidate for me much of what I feel concerning the transformation of silence into language and action. In becoming forcibly and essentially aware of what mortality meant for me, of what I wished and wanted for my life, however short it might be, priorities and omissions became very strongly etched in a merciless light, and what I most regretted were my silences. Of what had I ever been afraid?
To question or to speak as I believed could have meant pain or death, but we all hurt in so many different ways all the time, and pain will either change or end. Death, on the other hand, is the final silence. I was going to die, if not sooner than later, whether or not I had ever spoken myself.
My silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. But for every real word spoken, for every attempt I had ever made to speak those truths for which I am still seeking, I had made contact with other women. while we examined the words to fit a world in which we all believed, bridging our differences. Within those weeks of acute fear came the knowledge. Within the war we are all waging with the forces of death, subtle and otherwise, conscious or not, I am not only a casualty. I am also a warrior.
What are the words
are the
you
words
do not yet have?
You do not yet have.
What is it that you need to say? What are the tyrannies that you swallow day after day in an attempt to make your own, until you are sickened and die of them eventually, still in silence? Perhaps for some of you here now, I am the face of one of your fears. Because I'm a woman, because I'm Black, because I'm a lesbian, because I'm myself, a Black woman warrior poet, doing her work. Come to ask you, are you doing yours?
So, Lana, I'm going to read this. Page 21. And, of course, I am afraid. You can hear it in my voice. Because the transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation, and that always seems fraught with danger. But my daughter, when I told her of our topic and my difficulty with it, said, "Tell them about how you're never really a whole person if you remain silent. Because there's always that little one piece of you that wants to be spoken out. And if you keep ignoring it, it gets madder and madder and hotter. And if you don't speak it out, one day it will just up and punch you in the mouth." Well, I remember that conversation. Yeah, it's great to read that. It's great to read that. I am not the warrior my mother was, though. I recognize the truth of those words. When the stakes are high, and when there's an essential truth that needs to be spoken, I think that that's one of the lessons of my mother that I carry with me.
Each of us is here now because in one way or another, we share a commitment to language and to the power of language, and to the reclaiming of that language which has been made to work against us. In the transformation of silence into language and action, it is vitally necessary for each one of us to establish or examine her function in that transformation and to recognize her role as vital within that transformation. It is necessary to teach by living and speaking those truths which we believe and know beyond understanding. Because in this way alone we can survive, by taking part in a process of life that is creative and continuing, that is growth. And where the words of women are crying to be heard, we must, each of us, recognize our responsibility to seek those words out, to read them and share them and examine them in their pertinence to our lives, that we not hide behind the mockeries of separations that have been imposed upon us and which so often we accept as our own.
The whole cancer experience for my mom crystallized that idea that courage is not the absence of fear, but the action in the face of fear, that fear, which by nature is paralyzing, not be allowed to persist in being paralyzing. The stuff that she wanted to say, she felt these things were incredibly powerful, whether it was her work in South Africa, her work in the cancer journals, and when she talks about the sustenance of her community of women, and how they didn't all look one way. In the breast cancer process, although my mom had always been sustained by a community of women who didn't all look one way, now that there was this additional battle, not just on the breast cancer front, but also on the political front, because I think it sharpened her political focus, and it sharpened her urgency around her political focus. That she was very clear that those battle lines would break down along sometimes class lines, but not even necessarily, because there were folks of different classes who might engage in this battle too. Basically, our comrades are where we find them. That makes us, and it always makes us, a stronger fighting power. It makes us more dangerous.
And of course I am afraid. You can hear it in my voice. Because the transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation, and that always seems fraught with danger. This panel takes its name from these lines, which is partly why I felt compelled to excerpt that bit and not another. What is it that one can hear in the voice? What is it that Lorde is so certain can be perceived by a listener? In my memory of this passage, which I heard repeatedly as I edited my film, I associated this fear, which Lorde identifies as audible, with the fear of death. Yet returning to the passage now, I realize that Lorde attributes the fear not to death, or even the prospect of dying, but precisely to the subject of her well-known lecture, which became the basis of her memoir. The fear extends from a self-revelation, one that does not come easily, but which arouses an embodied unease, or shall I say, dis-ease in this instance, that expresses itself through the voice. Is it an attenuation of the voice, a trembling inhibition, or a discordant interference, a distortion? This transformation of the passivity of silence into the language of action, which is nothing less than the politicization of the self, is a necessary, if dangerous, pursuit. But according to the logic passed on from daughter to mother, an inverse chronology to the expected matrilineal inheritance, silence gestates in the body as lethal part objects that will take revenge upon the subject if prevented from transforming into speech. Speech has the potential of uniting these part objects into something of a whole. Or rather, language has the potential of gathering the parts of oneself into a politicized whole, a being that can, and indeed must, take part in the world and effect action. In short, for all its hazards, speech is a mode of survival. And what has voice to do with illness? If racism, sexism, violence, and illness threaten to silence us, to render us speechless, then voice is a means by which to protect ourselves. It may be how we do illness and not have it done to us. As I was mulling about what I would contribute to this panel, the Kavanaugh hearing was raging. One thing that struck me was something that was recounted in several news reports. Mark Judge, Kavanaugh's friend, who was cited as the only eyewitness to Blasey Ford's assault in her testimony, submitted a letter to the Senate Judiciary Committee stating, "As a recovering alcoholic and a cancer survivor, I have struggled with depression and anxiety. As a result, I avoid public speaking." This is not to judge those, not even Mark Judge, who suffer from depression and anxiety and fear of public speaking. I am surely sympathetic to these conditions. What I puzzle over is the use of cancer as an explanation for not coming forward to speak the truth. The destabilizing effects of cancer serve as a justification that needs no explanation, according to these reports. I can't help but think that for Audre Lorde, cancer calls upon her to speak truth to power, whereas for Judge, cancer excuses him from speaking. Judge enjoys the privilege of silence or refraining from speech. Blasey Ford might have chosen silence, but perhaps without consciously doing so, she followed Lorde's lead, for whom silence was never an option. As with AIDS activists who would also follow her, silence equaled death. Lorde writes, "What woman of color in America over the age of 15 does not live with the knowledge that our daily lives are stitched with violence and with hatred?" And to naively ignore that reality can mean destruction. When I read these words, having gone through 6 rounds of chemotherapy, they struck me with an unexpected familiarity. Unexpected because so few accounts of breast cancer were given from the perspective of a woman of color. In my experience as of 2010, breast cancer was still largely mediatized as a white woman's disease. To be spoken to and touched by a person whom one has never met and will never meet is a powerful experience to which many of us can probably relate. While at best all cultural productions surpass the limitations of human mortality, it is the poignant aim of illness narratives to transmit the mute privacy of pain into a public voicing. I can hear Lorde's voice and allow it to transform me. Even more miraculous, I've discovered through making the Cancer Journals Revisited a reciprocity that too is unexpected. Lorde's voice is in turn transformed through the vocalization of a young biracial woman, an older white lesbian, a trans man. Through these voices, my film enacts community and communal mourning, as well as celebration. A keen is a vocal performance of mourning. I share an affinity for this word and concept with Lorde, so I thought I would conclude with an excerpt from my book, Freud's Jaw and Other Lost Objects, which I adapted for the Museum of Dreams, a project conceived of and curated by Sharon Slowinski that explores the social and political significance of dream life. Slowinski is a scholar who has written several important books on visual culture, including visual culture and political theory. And these titles, 2 of the several books she's written, include Dreaming in Dark Times, 6 Exercises in Political Thought, and Photography and the Optical Unconscious. Before I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I dreamed that I had gained a new internal organ. It was called Keen, which afterward I thought might be a hybrid of my kidney and spleen. I didn't know if it was intended to purify me of toxins, the task my kidney performs, or to serve some essential but unknown purpose as my spleen does, or merely to occupy a space which would then be seen and sensed as an absence should it be removed. I didn't know what this organ Keen was supposed to mean to me. How was it supposed to serve me? Was it a kind of anticipatory recompense for a loss I was yet intended to suffer? I knew only that I looked up the word in the dictionary and found that it is the word for the wail of grief for the dead, sung at Irish funerals. I also discovered that Audre Lorde wrote a poem, Holographs, a critique of South African apartheid, the second stanza of which begins, 60,000 Pondo women keening on the mountain. Each of the stanzas, the 3 stanzas, ends with a question and a plaint on death and dying. The first on malnourished babies dying prematurely, the second on fathers going off to fight to their deaths, and the last on the imbrication of death and life. This is not the only time that Lorde expresses her pain as keening. She writes of the anger and hatred Black women feel against each other and themselves, which issues forth as a carnivorous keening, like the self-destructive she-wolf who chews off her paw to escape a trap. The keen may be that part of oneself that is sacrificed for survival. Lorde's longtime friend Adrienne Rich wrote a poem about a childhood friend of hers who had died of breast cancer, a woman dead in her 40s. We never spoke at your deathbed of your death, but from here on, I want more crazy mourning, more howl, more keening. Rich's verse bemoans the silence of death and calls for the reparative gestures of speech and mourning. It echoes the lament that Lorde hears from the South African mountaintop and the cry that she utters in miming the keening she-wolf. I give myself language in naming an imaginary part of myself keen. My keen, like Lorde's and Rich's poetry, might be regarded as a creation that can be used for mourning absence, that symbolizes but does not substitute for the lost object. So that's it. The little excerpt has a little more context in the book, which is about lost objects. So, thank you.
Obviously, there's so many things that we could discuss, and we'll keep discussing them, hopefully. And for now, I just have a ton of illegible notes in my sister's journal that she gave me since I forgot to bring a paper. And I'll just say some things, and we can speak, and we'll have time for a couple of questions from the audience. But thank you all so much. That was very moving in many ways to me. I'm picking just out of this mess of my writing. One thing, Audre Lorde's line read by her daughter, "I am doing my work, are you doing yours?" In each of your discussions, I kept thinking about labor and work and the onus of responsibility on patients to lead the charge of activism, or Carolyn talking about how within your larger body of work, visual art or art making does one thing and writing does another thing. And then of course how you use, Lana, how you use Lorde's quote within your film. I mean, there's so many ways that the word work operates, but I'm struck over and over again in all of these conversations for risk pool at large at how there is just no separation between these illnesses that we're speaking of or writing about and our lives and our sociality and our work. And that is it maybe something about an illness experience that just collapses all of those categories within an individual life. So yeah. Work, labor, that's one thing we can talk about, and just jump in if you want to say anything. Yeah, I think the other thing that I want to ask is, what does it mean to be a compelling narrative? And I thought a lot about that, Beza, when you were talking about how in this health activism, it's like there's this desire for the compelling narratives, and I fully understand that. I think that's easily understandable. And then thinking about it in relation to Carolyn's personal writing, Lana's also very personal work, or my own personal work, you are like, how to be a person in the age of autoimmunity is also like how to be a compelling narrative, and that, like that's asking a lot, and maybe not that I want to necessarily problematize that, but that could be something to discuss. I'd also just love to hear, what you thought of one another's talks.
Sure. So I thought the talks were fantastic, and I really relished the chance to listen to them in the context of the work that I'm still trying to think about and still trying to formulate. In terms of what it means to tell a compelling narrative or be one, there's this interesting sort of part of what I call in my work responsible patienthood, which basically signals to people sort of media practices and sort of cultural practices that tell us how we are to live in order to be a good patient in order to be a healthy patient. And so that means sort of consuming the right kinds of information. As part of the sort of proliferation of sources of information around health, we have the responsibility to consume them, to learn about our diseases and learn about our risks. And then also we have the responsibility now within this discourse to sort of act on them. And so that means we are to sort of act on our risks and sort of do these kinds of things. And so to be a compelling narrative, I think in a lot of ways is to signal that you are doing these things. And so one of the things that I see in these videos for the Fight for Our Health campaign is a lot of people saying that they deserve health insurance because they are productive members of society or because they want to be productive members of society. And so on that panel where I had 3 different images, the guy on the far right, his name is Spliff. He lives in Alaska and he has Crohn's disease and a number of issues that he's dealing with. And a lot of his narrative focuses on this idea that as long as he can get back to work, he's happy to work and sort of contribute to society and pay his fair share, but he thinks that the government should sort of do its part as well. And so a lot of these narratives are really about sort of what it means to be a productive member of society. And so there are questions of citizenship broadly, but also a lot of it is around work and labor and the idea that to be a good citizen and to be a good patient are essentially one and the same as long as you're doing your part.
You say it because I think we're thinking similar.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. I think like maybe like alternatively for me, I definitely think that there's this like really complicated relationship between illness and citizenship, right? For a lot of reasons in terms of healthcare access and all of these things, but also because of like of the question of capacity to work. And I think, or the fact that our ideas of citizenship are based on capacity. And I think, you know, what I'm interested in is like, we're talking a lot about compelling narratives, and it's like compelling narratives for who, for whom. And I think like a lot of the times when, or like for me, when I am writing in this genre, it's particularly for other sick people. It's not necessarily to make appeals for healthcare reform, of course, please, but you know, it's not, there's a kind of way in which these things are meant to build. Like, I think it's important, like, we already have, I think chronically ill and disabled people already have this relationship with institutions that's kind of like one directional. So to kind of access each other is a very complicated thing to try to do when you're used to the only way that you're having conversations around illness are like interfacing with the biomedical establishment, not talking to other sick people. It's kind of different from the ways in which you know, other experiences of identity are formulated. Like, it's not social in that way. And so the need to make it social is where for me is where like the politics kind of happen. And I think in some ways, instead of appeals to I don't know, I'm not trying to, it's hard to say, I'm not trying to say that appeals to healthcare aren't important. I'm trying to say that I'm personally invested in the ways in which illness and illness narratives can completely destabilize ideas of citizenship, why we would even want to aspire to them, how can we reformulate ideas of you know, belonging that are exclusive of capacity, you know, not like, you know, really sort of using illness, which is a thing that we all have in common, as the kind of foundation for these kinds of questions, instead of thinking of it as a thing that needs to be accommodated in order for people to continue being productive. Like, how is it that we can challenge ideas around productivity on a fundamental level? I understand why somebody like, what's Spliff? Spliff wants to, why this is sort of like the narrative, because it feels like that's the way you have to justify your existence, is to say, if you give me health care, I will be able to keep doing this thing, instead of saying like, oh, there is some inherent quality to my life regardless of whether I can or cannot work.
I kind of think we do need to problematize the idea of a compelling narrative, right? Because I think, well, why shouldn't a person's narrative be boring? I mean, why should it be compelling? Like, it's their narrative. And the whole idea of a pre-existing condition, I mean, we are humans, that's our pre-existing condition, and we all have a right to care based on, being the fact that we're human. I also just, but at the same time, I understand that Audre Lorde is a really compelling narrative, and she understood how to leverage that. And I think that she leverages the narrative of her entire being, not just the fact that she ended up having cancer, but that she is, as she always says, a Black lesbian feminist mother, poet, warrior, right? So I guess that's a way in which she could, maybe it's that she elected that to serve in that function. But yeah, that goes to the question I had about Blasey Ford and what does it mean to be called upon to have to tell the narrative and to what ends. And the only other little comment was I wanted to respond to your pulling out that quote about I'm doing my work, are you doing yours? I don't think that Lorde is only talking about labor. I think she's really talking about creative work or what she is called to do. So again, it would answer that call that I was trying to allude to with Blasey Ford and with Audre Lorde. They feel called to participate in some kind of political world in which they are invited to be in.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of echoing Carolyn, and we don't have, we can move on to other points as well and have questions from the audience, but do you, and I don't mean to only situate this in the conversation with the health activism for the ACA, but why shouldn't you have access to that health care? Why the need to claim a desire to be a productive member of society? It for obvious reasons, that works well in a health activism context, but I'm interested in different ways of narrating, be it an experimental film or a personal essay or a poem, whatever form of articulation it takes. What shape might a narrative look like? And there's no right or wrong answer. I mean, this is a very broad, I brought you three together because these conversations are the same and also fundamentally different. Like the contexts are different, but yeah, just the variety of ways to speak as a form of survival. Yeah.
I mean, that just makes me think about the way in which illness narratives are proliferate on the internet and on social media, and I think that in and of its that also might address this question about what the compelling illness narrative and what happens when through a kind of there are chronically ill people who are very visible around their experiences of illness every day on the internet, and those people instantiate a kind of community that is very connected with each other across people who have more or less access to community outside of their homes, etc., and that people who are not chronically ill might be tapped into or might not. But a lot of those things for me are I think what's so great about that stuff is that it's not compelling. It's incredibly mundane. It's not a good Instagram post, it's a bad one, but it's if you do it repeatedly, it starts to produce its own thing. It starts to be a way of tracking a certain kind of experience, and maybe it's not I don't think those things are compelling, but I think like what you're saying, actually what we need now are kind of mundane illness narratives, right? Like the fact that it, costs, it's kind of about, it's kind of similar to the health activism, in the sense that like there's like saying that it costs, hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep me alive every year it sounds kind of sensational, but it's also just kind of the truth. And, you can say that, and depending on who you say that to, it'll mean different things. You can say that to somebody and they'll be like, what? That's absurd. Or you could say it to another chronically ill person and they'd be like, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this focus on sort of to whom we need to be compelling, at least in the case of the case study that I'm looking at, is really about the idea that the campaign is targeting legislators who need to be convinced and who they believe should be convinced in a particular way, but also people who are not yet ill. And that is, I think, a particular designation that they're going for. Not people who are healthy, but the idea that we are not yet ill if we're right in that sort of category. I think the presumption is that people who have these illness experiences already know, they don't need to be convinced, right? So like the cost of care, and you don't need to sort of be persuaded there. And so this idea that it's about the particular audiences, and so this is, I think we could say, like a top-down approach, right? It's a labor union has a pretty sort of corporatist background that is looking to sort of speak a particular kind of language. And so if we're thinking about other kinds of narratives that don't need to be compelling or that are mundane, I think there's absolutely room for them. I think one of the issues here is that it takes this particular approach, and one of the challenges that I've been thinking about in kind of drawing on this approach in the sort of idea of like building a kind of data commons is that it does put a lot of the onus onto patients to kind of perform these kinds of illness narratives, right? And so that's one of the issues, and it creates this dynamic where you essentially have to ask for your own care that I think you should be entitled to, and it becomes this sort of like suffering porn where people have to really sort of relive these experiences over and over again. And so that's a dynamic that I explicitly don't want to recreate, and I'm trying to challenge, but in thinking about sort of what it would mean to build this kind of a data store, I'm still trying to figure out sort of how that works. But yeah, I do think that the idea that you need to tell this sensational story is a bad way to go, right? It's a slippery slope, but to the extent that this is what has worked, or this is what worked insofar as it did in the summer of 2017, I'm trying to figure out sort of what else we might do with this model.
Mm-hmm. Should we ask for, does anyone in the audience have a question?
When you were speaking about transforming into speech, or the way that language, I guess, transforms speech, and also transforms the body and the objects that the body wears. I was wanting kind of more on this process of transforming, or this like kind of power that language has to kind of embody through performance this assemblage of the body, right? And the fading of the object, human, subject kind of spectrum. If you could speak more on that, I found that really fascinating.
The whole idea of the transformation of silence into language and action is obviously Lorde's. That's interesting that you bring up. I feel like in making the film, there was a kind of transformation through the vessel of these 27 bodies that spoke her words. So that is a little bit, I think what you're referring to is that transformation of her words and her voice at the beginning, it was her archival voice, into the bodies of these other readers, people, participants. I'm not sure what else to say.
Like the prosthesis, too, like how,
oh, right.
Freud's jaw, right?
Mm-hmm.
Became a part of Freud. I just thought that was your name.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Hey, so I'm really interested in what seems to be coming up again and again, this tension between sort of exposing a narrative of illness versus keeping maybe guarded lines between what you do expose and what you don't. And I think, so what that's bringing up to me is a bit the exploitative nature of, let's say, big data sets, and how, for example, the relationship between insurance companies and Ancestry.com or 23andMe, people making that data available for connection purposes, but then insurance sort of taking that as a means to discover pre-existing conditions and things like that. So I'm kind of interested in how alternatives or almost small data sets can be made in these ways that you can share within a community that is contained or bubbled, to be able to sort of gain whatever benefits or knowledge share can happen through that is not exploited by sort of larger corporate interests. And I'm curious if any of you have experienced that kind of like smaller community knowledge share that can work within the confines and boundaries of people's illnesses and people in those communities, but sort of set up the barriers for who can and cannot access in a way that's sort of intentional and meaningful for the people in those communities.
So I'm a founding member of a collective called Canaries, which functioned as an art collective for many years, and was before that was a support group for, I guess at this point I would say, people with marginalized genders who are living with chronic illness, and with a particular focus on autoimmunity. And while we're on hiatus in terms of making like public artworks together, the group still very much functions as a private listserv. So this is like a private listserv that you really can't, have access to, and that unless you claim some kind of like identitarian like affiliation with the group. And within the group, what's sort of discussed is a lot of obviously really personal, private information around people navigating their health, and usually people sort of looking for a wide variety of things, from talking about chemotherapeutic protocols to, whatever like alternative holistic treatment is like on the up and up. It's usually a site for like sharing information about medical things, also for emotional support, and then also for some other things too, which include like sharing medications, which are things that can't be done publicly because that's illegal. So there's I think there's like a lot of, different kinds of ways in which sick people are networked, or that's what I'm kind of interested and invested in. I think the point I was trying to make earlier is that, like, yes, there needs to be, trying to figure out the healthcare situation is like primary, and also there needs to be a lot of effort towards kinds of like, fugitive practices around resiliency for sick people, like how do you survive the ups and downs of, the political system? That's not something that is necessarily going to change. It's not like, people have found ways to take care of themselves for long periods of time. And so I'm also very much suspicious of, trying to create, like, I can't even use the phrase data set in relationship to my body. It's like, what does that even mean? So, yeah.
We have time for one more question, if there's any more.
Hi. Thank you all so much for your presentations. I thought it was really compelling to hear the ways that maybe implicitly, like, people's trauma is a part of the conversation that we're having when we talk about how people do illness. And so, I think the word trauma at this point, feels very dispersive in terms of what it might actually be referring to. But I also am... I was saying earlier, I'm a social worker, and I think a lot about mental illness. And I guess I'm just curious, for the three of you, the ways that mental illness and physical illness interact, and particularly the way that psychoanalytic theory might be useful, or the way that more holistic ways of managing one's health often seem to do this integrative work of thinking about the body and the mind as being interrelated. So I guess the question here is, how does trauma or mental illness come into our conversation when we're talking about how we do illness?
I mean, I think that's the subject of my book, somewhat. Definitely the psychoanalytic angle. I think the reason that psychoanalysis is hopeful is because it already conceives of human beings as kind of disparate parts, and that it has a theory of trauma. And so, at least for me, I was interested in how psychoanalysis hadn't really taken up physical, organic illnesses. But obviously, it's been oriented to mental illness. What else was part of your question?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's kind of the subject of this whole essay that I'm writing, that I'm hopefully finishing soon. I know. Yeah, I mean, I think for me it's really hard to even make that distinction, and I think that's why sometimes I don't even use, I've kind of, I write the word Crohn's disease, but I also have multiple other diagnoses. I feel like discrete diagnoses are just not really good enough to even describe what's happening and not encompassing of it, so I've kind of stopped even using clinical language in relationship to my experience, because it's just it's so expansive, it's in excess of any of the language that I have to even understand what's going on. And I think that's a really important, I think it's happening right now a lot in disability community too, which is that psychiatric disabilities were really excluded from that discourse for a really long time. And we're the problem that the reason why we have this problem is because of really foundational things that have to do, it's decisions that other people made, the conceptions that other people made about what that the mind and the body are two separate things and that they're not related, that not only structure our experience of the body, but also structure our experience of politics, of what it means to be a liberal subject, all of this stuff. And I think those things are really interrelated. And I think bringing connections between mental illness and physical illness, it's even saying it like that is annoying, but having to even think of those things as two discrete things and then forcefully connect them in language doesn't even make any sense. And I think the relationship between those two things is also continuous with other stuff, right? Which that once we start connecting physical illness to mental illness, then we have to start connecting it to all of these other circumstances of our lives, like race and gender and class and mobility, access and all of these other things, and how they have a deep impact on those relationships. Because we can't, some experiences of life are more disabling than others. Yeah.
Just a quick note. So yeah, I also don't treat them as separate. In my first book project, I'm looking at the ways in which stand-up comedians and stand-up comedy as a practice are used to kind of have these kinds of intimate conversations around health. And so while in that book I treat different case studies discretely, there's a mental health chapter, I don't actually sort of treat them as sort of things that are separate or part of separate systems that need to sort of be defined distinctly in terms of how we understand illness experiences.
I'm going to end there. Thank you all so much. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. And yeah, I'm very grateful for you. Thanks.